Now, no one disputes that all economic systems reflect the intrinsic self-concern of human beings.
This depends on whether you're talking about individual self-concern or collective self-concern. Yes, it's true that economic systems are supposed to serve human beings in general, however effective or ineffective they may be at doing so. However, people would dispute the idea that all economic systems are based on individual human beings acting in a self-serving way.
But only capitalism creates a group of people known as entrepreneurs.
Bow down before your capitalist overlords.
Who have no choice but to concern themselves with the needs and desires of others.
Well, just one empirical look at what actually happens in the real world under capitalism is enough to falsify this. At a time when humanity urgently needs to rely on renewable sources of energy in order to prevent environmental catastrophe, the driving force of capital is to get as much oil out of the ground as possible while funneling money into anti-science propaganda campaigns that deliberately mislead the public. The 67 richest people in the world have the same amount of wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world. If capitalists were concerned with the needs and desires of others, maybe they wouldn't destroy the environment and leave the rest of us to clean up the mess. Maybe they would, share, rather than keep all of the wealth for themselves and leave literally billions of people to starve to death. Their primary purpose is to make as much profit as possible, and any capitalist who doesn't meet that requirement will be replaced by someone who does.
These others are their customers. Few economists, however, actually study the behavior of these entrepreneurs, the creative leaders of capitalist businesses.
Hail, hail the capitalist overlords.
If they did, they would discover that entrepreneurs, by the very nature of what they do, must shun greed.
Oh, well, this will be a fucking laugh.
First and foremost, responding to others is the very opposite of greed.
Not necessarily. This is assuming that it's impossible to respond to others in an exploitative or deceptive fashion. But this is bollocks. Suppose that I have a lorry filled with bottles of water. I go through a desert and find someone dying of thirst. If I say to that person, I'll give you a bottle of water, but you'll be in debt to me for £1 million for the rest of your life. Deal? Sure, I'm responding to that person's need for water, but that doesn't mean it's not greedy. It's perfectly possible to respond to others in such a way that exploits their situation for your own personal gain. Responding to others is only the opposite of greed if you respond to others out of genuine concern to meet their needs, not if you just use them as a means to your own ends, like capitalists do.
Second, greed in the economic sphere.
I love your use of the economic sphere, as if to convey the idea that your economic school of thought is objective and rational, and its ideas are somehow officially true in economics. You're not fooling anyone. Your economic school of thought is just as ideologically motivated as anybody else's, and just because you support the status quo, that doesn't mean you're somehow objective.
Is normally expressed as the immediate consumption of goods and services. I grab what I can without regard for others. But entrepreneurs must begin by saving, which is defined as foregoing consumption to achieve long-term goals.
Well, it only benefits the person doing the saving. Plus, it requires that you be in the minority, because if everybody decided to withhold their money and forego consumption, there would be an economic crisis. And, ultimately, the long-term goal for capitalists is just to make a profit. I don't see why someone doing things that exclusively advance their own interests is somehow altruistic. You can't just say that they're not greedy by arbitrarily deciding that greed is purely a temporal difference in the rate at which someone consumes commodities. There are economic practices in our society that don't involve immediate consumption of commodities that nevertheless could still reasonably be called greedy. Some people, through the process of capital accumulation, end up with such ridiculous amounts of money they don't know what to do with it. They don't spend it on luxuries for themselves because they've got enough already. They don't even reinvest it into their businesses. It just sits there in offshore bank accounts in tax havens, not being used to contribute to society in any way, while masses of people struggle for basic necessities. And if we're going by this logic, then this is not greedy. It's greedy to spend money, but it's not greedy to make money. The natural conclusion to draw from this is that the more money you have, the less greedy you are, because you're not spending it, and the less money you have, the more greedy you are, because you're not saving it all up. The poor are greedy, and the rich are selfless. It's almost as if the entire line of argument that he's making here is just to praise people with lots of money. How the fuck does this ball bag sleep at night with such a soulless profession?
Often it takes months, sometimes many years, to bring a new product or service to market. Furthermore, entrepreneurs must collaborate with others, building teams to achieve their aims. In designing their goods and services, they must, once again, focus not on their own needs, but on the needs of others. This, too, is the opposite of greed.
It's true that research and development, because it requires a significant degree of sacrifice, and it isn't just concerned with how to make a short-term profit, is a big risk to take, which is perhaps why capitalists don't undertake this task on their own, but depend on the conservative nanny state to do the research and development for them, privatizing the profits and socializing the losses, such as in the Pentagon system of military keynesianism that was implemented in the US through much of the 20th century. And already I can hear the exasperated chorus, but this is nasty corporatism, not the nice and cuddly kind of capitalism that only exists in my head. Fundamentally, it's in the interests of the capitalists to externalize costs onto others, and the state has always helped to satisfy this goal. The supposed distinction between capitalism and so-called corporatism is absolutely meaningless in the real world.
So what entrepreneurs do when they seek profit is far more than self-interest.
This is neither the case in theory nor in practice.
Rather, profit is a measure of how well a company has served others.
You see, the richer the CEO, the bigger the heart. This is a true fact that you should believe.
Under capitalism, a business prospers only if customers voluntarily trade for its output.
Yeah, you know how the American United Fruit Company controlled almost the entire Guatemalan economy throughout much of the 20th century? That was because of the magic of the free market. The fact that Guatemala was ruled by dictatorial puppet states and military juntas, making a concerted effort for decades to crush popular working class movements, had absolutely nothing to do with it, and was purely a coincidence. Forget the massacre of indigenous peoples, the success of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala all comes down to customer satisfaction.
And it's only by improving its service to others that a business can thrive and grow.
This fails to account for planned obsolescence. Many successful businesses, Apple for example, will deliberately design products so that they break easily after a certain period of time, either to resell the same product or to give the customer a reason to get the latest upgrade, which will just be barely improved and more expensive than the previous version. It's wasteful, infuriating, and profitable. This also fails to account for the role of mass advertising, an entire industry dedicated to creating ill-informed consumers making irrational choices. It isn't in the interests of capitalists to inform the market about both the good and the bad aspects of a given product. And considering the fact that most consumers, through no fault of their own, won't have the time to research the products they buy, they will most likely be getting most of their information about products from ads. As such, consumers making decisions in the marketplace aren't necessarily acting in objective information. Businesses can easily get away with selling shite products by using deceptive advertising.
If the entrepreneur pursues his own interests first and his customers' interests second, his business will fail. And sooner or later, an altruistic entrepreneur will surpass him.
Well, it's true that capitalists can't just arbitrarily raise the prices of their products over the production costs to make a profit when they're in a state of competition with each other in the marketplace. But it's deceptive to assert that they're therefore altruistic. Capitalists are more than capable of ruthlessly pursuing their own interests without consumers feeling as though they're being ripped off, mainly by exploiting the labor force. During the production process, workers, people who sell their ability to work to a boss in exchange for a wage, produce much more value than is necessary to keep them going as workers. They only get a fraction of this value back as wages, and their wages will roughly match the cost of the products needed to keep them alive and be able to work each day. The rest of the value created by the workers is absorbed by bosses as profit or surplus value. In other words, bosses make a profit by making workers put more value into the system than they get in return and taking this value for themselves.
Capitalism at its essence, then, is a competition of giving.
Given the aforementioned analysis, I think we can say that's bollocks.
Of course, self-interest is involved. But the genius of capitalism,
Obey your capitalist overlords. Obey.
and only capitalism, is that it channels self-interest into altruism.
The notion that capitalism is altruistic is a crock of shit. The notion that capitalism is unique in the extent of its altruism is like covering a football in shit and then kicking it out of the stadium. Autonomous forms of organisation based on self-management, be they workers' cooperatives, housing cooperatives or communes, do far better to nurture the altruistic side of human beings. Why? Because people work together towards common goals and nobody sits at the top of the property milking everybody else for cash.
Entrepreneurs can only help themselves by helping others.
Again, bollocks.
All those who have started a business and made great sacrifices to do so know the drama of that first day.
And if you're in the majority of people who haven't started up a business before, you don't know. So shut up and know your place before you criticize the rich.
Does the world want what I have to give?
Sell.
Whether it's an immigrant opening a beauty salon or Steve Jobs selling an Apple computer.
Oh, don't give Steve Jobs as an example of risk or sacrifice. The technologies that are now sold by Apple for profit were first developed in the state sector, funded by the taxpayer. It's not exactly Steve Jobs taking a huge risk.
Success is far from guaranteed. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Sure, it's not guaranteed. If you aren't ruthless enough, you'll be kicked out by someone who is. It's a process of selecting the worst.
Those courageous souls.
Courageous souls? Oh, for fuck's sake.
The entrepreneurs who are the beating heart of capitalism.
If anyone's the beating heart of capitalism, it's the working class.
Who bring us the endless material benefits we enjoy.
Your iPhone was not made by Steve Jobs. It was made by Chinese factory workers being paid with starvation wages for long hours of labor so exhausting that they're falling asleep on the job.
From ATM machines to life-saving medicines.
Speaking of life-saving medicines, isn't it interesting that big pharmaceutical companies are failing to develop an Ebola vaccine because it isn't immediately profitable to develop vaccines for diseases that exist principally in poor countries? HIV, malaria, and TB are similar examples. I'm not making any claims that there's somehow a conspiracy to hide vaccines. I'm just saying that private companies aren't very good at it, given the way that they function as institutions concerned mainly with short-term profit. Again, this is perhaps why most vaccine development has been undertaken in the state sector.
Should be held up for admiration, not torn down. Altruism is the very reason for capitalism's existence, and why it remains the hope of civilization. I'm George Gilder for Prager University.
The main premise of this video is that capitalism is somehow altruistic, and I remain thoroughly unconvinced by this premise. But I don't think that they genuinely believe this crap either. The problem is that it's morally intuitive that we ought to treat each other in an altruistic fashion. And if capitalism is corrosive to altruism, which it clearly fucking is, then capitalism is morally counterintuitive. But you're not supposed to come to that conclusion. It doesn't matter if it's correct, it's wrong. So, they have to make up this lie that capitalism is somehow altruistic. And we ought to look at the rich as though they're fucking saints who are here to give and give and give, and they're the ones who provide for everybody. So how dare these nasty socialists criticize them? But this picture of capitalism as some haven of altruism is easily falsified given one look at the world that we actually fucking live in. It's even more ridiculous to assert that capitalism is somehow unique in the extent of its altruism when there are alternative systems out there that can be demonstrated to work, which are far more altruistic than the hyper-competitive, greed-driven sink-or-swim society that we live in now. And given the current situation humanity is in currently, I think we ought to consider pursuing these alternatives in order to better take care of the environment, to eradicate inequality, to care for the vulnerable, and ultimately to give everyone more control over their own lives, whether that's at home, in the workplace, or elsewhere. The real beating heart of capitalism is the working class. It's the working class that has the power to end capitalism and build a new society in the shell of the old. The workers are the ones who built all of the riches that humanity enjoys today. And it is high time for the workers to assert their right to the common inheritance. For more anarchist content, subscribe to Libertarian Socialist Rants and Anarchist Collective. Thanks for watching.